Hello, buddy. Welcome back to the Tin Man Score channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor, and today I'm reading the final chapter out of the South Carolina Ghosts from the Coast to the Mountains book by Nancy Roberts. And the title of this chapter is called The Phantom Horsemen of Columbia. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? Not far from the State House in Columbia, a lone figure with a malacca cane in his hand made his way down Lady Street. Perhaps the dampness in the night air was causing the old wound in Raymond MacDonald's leg to twitch with pain as it did tonight. But despite this, he was still a strong and active man. His large black collie trotted along beside him as always, and there was no premonition that anything unusual was about to occur in his life. He had left his daughter Elizabeth's house after a visit, just as he had done so many other evenings, and was strolling to his own home near the corner of Bull and Blanding Streets. The fragrance of honeysuckle enveloped him. The streets were deserted and most of the large homes darkened. Yeah, that's unusual. You would think that every street would be lit and full of life. But then again, some people might be on the night of the town and they won't be back until later. Often there was a light in the upstairs bedroom of the Fraser house. Yes, it was there tonight, and he knew that Mrs. Fraser, a lovely woman who was widowed like himself, was probably reading. At that moment his collie barked, and he could feel the dog's body pressed against his leg, almost throwing him off balance. What in the name of heaven was the matter with the animal? He cursed under his breath. Suppose Rex's barking disturbed the widow, and she thought that someone was lurking in the dense shrubbery surrounding the house. Hush, hush, Rex, he admonished, and on he went for about 50 feet when the dog cowered and began to bark once more. He had never known Rex to behave this way, for the dog was almost too brash and adventurous. He spoke comfortingly, patted him, and the animal's trimming subsided. That dog is smart. He probably sensed either somebody was about to come out and attack him, or he's sensing an unearthly presence. At that moment, something large and white hurtled toward him out of the darkness. He had no time to even raise an arm to protect himself. There was a sound of whirring wings within inches of his face. It was an enormous white owl, and its wing spread seemed to have been 6 feet, and then it was gone. MacDonald had stumbled, almost fallen, and recovered himself. The near collision with the owl had left him shaken. He told himself that he was only feeling the tensions everyone was experiencing the spring of 1914, for there were anonymous signs of war in Europe. Early that evening, he had stood in front of a bulletin board with a crowd reading news of the German Kaiser's latest threats. Over that tinderbox of the Balkans, where wars were ignited, the German leader waved his saber in inflamed emotions while the world held its breath. First of all, I would have been terrified when that owl came towards my face. If he's got a 6-foot wingspan, whew, that's a gigantic beast. But also, if I was living during this time period, I would be scared that the Germans would have made a threat towards America and they start coming over here. In World War II they almost did, but I'm glad they didn't. The corner of Bull and Blanded Streets were only a short distance when the dog began to bark again. Seized with irritation, MacDonald stopped to break a switch from a bush to chastise the animal. Could the full moon be disturbing the dog? His eyes searched the sky. As he looked toward the corner, he saw a most astonishing sight. High in the tops of the mammoth oaks was a sharply etched ghostly figure of a horseman. He could see it plainly, shining silvery white against the leaves. It was like an equestrian statue. The horse and rider were of heroic size. He was able to pick out every detail. There was the saddle, the reins, the bridle, even the flowing tail. All were clearly defined. Amazed, he stood staring at the treetops, and as he did, the horse reared up as if eager to be off on some faraway mission. As he watched, he gradually became aware that he was not alone. A man and woman were walking on the opposite side of the street, arm in arm. He watched curiously. The couple must have taken a room at the nearby lodging house, for they were not from his neighborhood. They reached the opposite corner, completely unaware that he was standing in the shadows just across the street from them. And here's a picture representing what he was seeing. I would have thought it was a statue too, but if it was glowing white like this, I'd be scared out of my mind. Suddenly he saw the man raise his arm and point toward the treetops. His companion looked upward and stiffened a scream. "Hush, for heaven's sakes," he heard the man say, and for a moment the pair stared at the sky. Then the woman broke free and began to run in the direction of the Roman house, the man close at her heels. He knew the pair had seen the horseman as he had, and in a sense he was reassured. There was no rational explanation for what he had witnessed, and if it had not been for the obvious fright of the couple, he would have doubted his own senses. Relieved, he reached his front door, and after hanging his clothes in the wardrobe, he laid down to sleep. But all night long he tossed and turned and refought the battles of years ago. Once more he was part of General Hampton's cavalry, fighting from the wilderness to Cold Harbor, sleeping upon the ground, thrusting his sword into wildly shouting men in blue, dimly aware of gray-clad figures lying on the ground, hearing the frantic whimpering of riderless horses, panic-stricken from the smoke and fire of battle. The next morning he awoke to rays of sunlight coming through the tall windows of his bedroom, and knowing that it had been the soft sort of nightmare he had not suffered in decades, he fell back into an exhausted, dreamless slumber. That evening, after the cook left, he followed his usual custom of walking over to his daughter's home. When he arrived, he saw immediately that she was bursting with excitement. "Father, have you heard the news? Everyone is talking about a ghost horseman they have seen in the treetops at the corner of Blandon and Bull Streets. We want to see it. Will you walk over with John and me?" Arriving at the site of the apparition, they found a crowd already gathered. 10 minutes past 15 and half an hour, and still there was nothing to be seen. Suddenly there was the figure of a white horseman in the sky, and a gasp rose from the crowd. "It's one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse," shouted an old man. Whew. Yeah, that would be scary to call it that. If you see one horseman, where are the others? Then you know, oh crap, something bad's going to happen. Oh, something evil is to come upon us that will ravage and lay waste this land. "Lordy, Lordy," came a choirs of awe-struck voices, and above it could be heard a Negro woman crying out, "The angel Gabriel is fixing to blow his horn. Our sins done for us out." Again came the choirs of voices, "Oh, do, Lord, help us." Raymond told his daughter he had seen it the night before, but it could offer no explanation. Finally, a bank of clouds covered the moon, and the horseman could no longer be seen. Returning to his home, he somehow felt impelled to go to the bottom drawer of the old mahogany wardrobe in his room and withdraw a pile of old pictures. One by one he sorted through them, not really knowing why. It was almost midnight when his eyes fell upon the most treasured picture of the collection. It was the one of General Wade Hampton, seated on his horse. He dropped the picture, and Rex, who had been asleep on the floor beside him, scrambled to his feet, began to howl mournfully, and with his tail between his legs, ran from the room. Raymond held the picture under the light and stared at the broadly built man under whom he had served in the Civil War. There were the great muscles of arm and leg, the wide squared shoulders and strong neck, with the large head carried high, the profile with the long side whiskers was one of the leonine handsomeness. It was a man he would have recognized anywhere, a man whose heroic figure had continued to despite all even during the last days of his life. But most important of all, it was the image in every detail of the phantom rider he had seen in the treetops. When he awoke the following morning, he was still in his chair. A glass of cognac he had poured was untouched on the table beside him, and the picture had slipped from his hand. Each night that spring, crowds continued to gather to see the horseman in the sky, and as the time went on, MacDonald was not the only one who believed that the phantom rider was Wade Hampton. Had General Hampton returned to warn of turbulent days ahead? Was this a prophetic appearance before a time of crisis for the country? Mrs. Jenny Clarkson Dreher of Columbia recalls having had the figure pointed out to her when she was a child. It is a well-established fact that many saw it. The end. You know, I was just fixing to say that it was the soldier that he worked with. He probably came back just to check on him, or, like they said, to warn of the coming doom that's about to happen. End of days, another war, who knows. But I'm glad I finished that book, so I'm not reading it again. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those post notifications for more book reading content like this. This has been another successful installment of the Tin Man Score channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey Tin Man Taylor, and that's a wrap, and that's the deal.